Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another U.S. History 3 lecture. This one's on the 1980s and the 1990s American politics, U.S. History 3. We're looking at kind of the shift into the politics that is starting to look more like our modern current political society. In case you're wondering, in the textbook this covers topics 19.1 and 19.2. And the terms list is here. Do make sure you know these terms because, quite frankly, some of these key terms are going to come up again in your everyday life because you probably hear them in the news and whatnot. We will be looking at them in the context of the 1980s and the 1990s, but it's good to know these concepts. So, the reason why we need to talk about why politics changes in the 80s and 90s is because, like, during the Cold War, the U.S. political field was actually not as diverse and it was more mixed. Democrats and Republicans were the two major parties. However, their main focus was fighting communism, and they had very similar views on domestic affairs. Really, the major differentiation between the two is that there was a subgroup of Democrats called the Southern Democrats that were anti-African American, and they were challenged and beat down throughout the civil rights movement, not without immense struggle. But before that, you wouldn't have seen necessarily as much difference, or at least not the differences we're looking for. Some of the policies of, say, Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy would have not looked like their modern-day political parties' decisions. But we'll talk about those in a bit. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is what is the shift to modern politics. Because the Democrats and the Republicans have been around for quite some time, but how they've operated and different things like that change over time, and it's worth being aware of that. Now, these two are going to come to represent these concepts of liberalism and conservatism. What are these? We'll talk about that in the context of this class, and who was what in the context of this class. So, to kick things off, to keep things simple, we'll start with the very basics. The Republicans, the GOP, they're represented by an elephant, and they're typically what we would consider conservative. The Democrats, represented by a donkey, are typically considered liberal. Now, what are liberalism and conservatism? We'll talk about that in a second. It is important to note that liberalism and conservatism have different meanings across different time and different spaces. For example, if you were to use the French Revolution definitions of liberalism and conservatism, they wouldn't make sense in this time period, because the French revolutionaries had very different concepts of what is conservative, what is liberal, to the point that I'm not going to give you an example because that'll just confuse you. So do be warned that when you see these words thrown around, you probably want to double check what the speaker or article is referring to, what this means, because depending on who you ask, when you ask, the answer is completely different. But to break it down quite simply, we'll look at the differences and then the similarities. Conservatives in American politics of the late 20th century favored free market. They were big into the concept of individualism. They preferred private organizations, and they favored deregulation. Liberals in American political society of the late 20th century favored government intervention in social problems such as homelessness and unemployment. They prefer government intervention in economic issues, and they prefer the use of regulation to meet different goals, such as environmental is one of the examples that will come up quite a bit in the news and leading through this time period. Now, fundamentally, both liberals and conservatives believe in these core, what we call American values. liberty, equality, etc., etc. However, it is worth noting that these values are understood and expressed very differently by these two groups. The conservatives' idea of liberty is there may be some applications that are practically different from the liberals' concept of liberty. And so that is something worth noting as well. So you may want to make a quick little chart, a Venn diagram of these concepts, because quite frankly, this is how you keep track of who's who and what they believe in for the time period we're studying. But now we're going to look at the conservatives first, because they come to rule the 80s, at least at the presidential level. Actor turned politician Ronald Reagan is going to come to represent conservatism in the 80s, and he's going to continue to be an inspiration for conservatism all the way up, continuing to this day. And his presidency is sometimes referred to as the Reagan Revolution or the Conservative Revolution, things like that. His presidency is noted for embodying the conservative values such as tax cuts. This is probably one of his biggest legacies that's continued on. Deregulation and privatization. Privatization, just for practical purposes, is where instead of the government taking care of something, the government contracts a private corporation to handle it, or something like that. Particular examples of privatization might be in a town. Privatization might be where instead of the city running public utilities, the public utilities are handled by a private corporations that manage these utilities. It varies from case to case. Also, there's going to be a great deal of talk of reducing the national debt. Essentially, this is one of those big things that comes up. This will come up again and again, and just a fair warning, both one of the things that you see happen often is while national debt was something that people, both political parties, say is a big concern, they're mainly concerned about making sure their own projects are funded. So with like Ronald Reagan was very concerned with the national debt, but his foreign policy of aggressively combating communism and massive military spending to combat communism really built up the national debt. It's just one of those things that comes up a bit. We will talk about some of that more controversial aspects of the anti-communist efforts during this administration in class with the Iran-Contra affair, as pictured here. But projects like the Strategic Defense Initiative are some of the things that the Reagan administration will spend a lot of money on. Just in case you're wondering, economically, Ronald Reagan is in favor of something that is called supply-side economics. It's also called Reaganomics, but supply-side economics, you've heard about it before. I believe it came up in U.S. history too. But essentially the idea is, this is what the conservatives favored, is if you decrease taxes, it will encourage private enterprises to put more money into their corporations, increasing employment and increasing prosperity. That is the theory behind supply-side economics. This is in opposition to Keynesian economics, which you learned about a bit with the New Deal, where essentially the government's a bit more involved in regulating the economy and keeping it stable. But we'll look at the economics bit in more detail because we want to do that in good detail. But here's a chart that kind of helps. And it looks at how do you prevent economic recession, or how do you reduce the damages of economic recession. So we're going to look more at Ronald Reagan's presidency in more detail in class. We're going to look at the Iran-Contra affair. We'll look at the political spectrum in more detail in class. And we'll just dive into more detail. In any case, I hope this helps, and until later.